So let me thank Dr. Purvish sir to sprouting a idea, a seed to the whole course. So it started for another meeting where we discussed that we get to hear. Let's start the sharing slide. Just a minute. So we get the opportunity to hear a lot of talks about regulations and how to conduct a clinical trial. This course is a little different that we are concentrating on things which are not discussed freely and in a very interactive way. So as I said earlier, there are a lot of courses which are there which talk about ethics and regulatory obligations for a PI to conduct a clinical trial, both at global and national level. Few of the ESMO orientations are there, and even the national level, there are few of the. So there's a certified course even for the conduct of clinical trial in the by the SWAYAM app. But what we feel is in those lectures, the things are not covered are that's which we'll be trying to cover, and we have to wanting to have a interactive sessions where we understand what we are doing. That we want to recruit more patients, we want to do follow the rules, we want to make a good name in the clinical trials. There is additional income, but tons of work. With that, the course objective is to learn from, I can see Ghanashyam, Biswas sir and a lot of other pioneers who done an exceedingly good job of a clinical trials. Their nuisance of patient selections or conduction of the regulatory obligations has been exemplary, and they look towards a clinical trial with a with with an expertise which we lack. So this course is scheduled for 4 days, almost 7 p.m. to 8:30, and it will be spoken mostly about practical tips and experience sharing. And it will be no regulations or theory classes because it's well covered in most of the things. Today's session is we'll be covering the introductions. So with this, I will introduce Shyam, Biswas to start the things. And to just highlight to people who are participating, there are baseline MCQs to understand the topic and outline, and final MCQs will be assessed for certification. Sir, Dr. Ghanashyam Biswas, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Vinayak. So good evening. Good evening, Parikh, sir. Yeah, Kashish.
Can we have
slides?
Yes, sir. I'll just share the slides.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Kashish. So in next 20 minutes, my job is to actually address minimum infrastructure required for me to become a PI for my first trial. And you can see the photo. So I took my Covaxin today. So I just posted it. So next. So for everything you do, you need a kick. And to become the star, the clinical trial is so all about. So what Vinayak and Dr. Purvish are, the attempt is to that. So many of you new medical oncologists, so you get interested in the subject and take over clinical trial, which is so important. Next. So these are two mentors. On the left-hand side, you can see these are the 4 DMs of TMH first batch, and I'm Dr. Purvish, sir. So I completed my DM in 2004, and I joined. I stayed there for a year or so post DM and started my clinical trial. And so my first clinical trial with Dr. Purvish sir was the Avastin trial in metastatic colorectal. On the right-hand side, so once I came back to Odisha, so you can see the mentor 2, he is Dr. Soren Das. We call him Munnu Bhai, and he was my senior in medical college. He actually was into an Excel Life Sciences. He mentored to start clinical trial in Odisha at 2005 when things were absolutely not happening here. And I owe my gratitude to him and Purvish sir, who actually had the seed in me for the clinical trials. And that's how the journey started. Next. So the requirements, so above everything, so law and guidelines, ethics committee. So you need an institution, sponsors, CROs. So definitely patient and attendants, investigator and team, lab supports. So, and overall our basic infrastructure. So if you talk about three basic things, roti, kapra and makan, so which I started in 2005, and I can say in 2021, it is now butter branded and luxurious. Next. So you need an institute, a clinical establishment to start your clinical trials. So that is the basic requirement. Next. So once you start, so you need to have an ethics committee formulation, and that's how. So it took almost 7-8 years, initial years, to form an ethics committee, and that's named as Institutional and Ethics Committee, Spurs Hospital in February 2013. And we got the EC registration. So every 3 years we get it renewed. And probably that was the first time a DCGI approved clinical center in the private sector got approved in the state of Odisha. Next. So who can be the investigators? On the left-hand side, you can see, so my MD physician, senior retired from IGH Raulkela. So she took over the diabetes and hypertension and many other medical, and I took over the oncology in the form of clinical trials. Next. Next.
Ghanashyam's video seems to have frozen.
I think there is I think link is an issue, sir.
Yeah. We'll just wait for a while. Ghanashyam, if you are hearing us, we cannot hear you.
Please, sir, actually.
Yeah.
Sir, I think sir is facing some issues. Sir, he's just logged out.
Okay. So while we are waiting for Dr.
The laws and guidelines, so Indian law, these are ICH GCPs for the pharmaceutical products of trials in 1996, which got amended, then the ICMR, and then followed by FDA and the UA guidelines. Next. So the ethics committee, we need to know that, so we need to have an odd number, 7, 9, it can be 11, formed as per the guidelines set up in the new drugs and clinical trials rules, registers with the CDSCO, adequate number and mix of members, initial and ongoing interim review of all projects written SOP. Next. So the principles, so you can, the eponym is ALCOAC. So ensure source data that is accurate, legible, so contemporaneous, that is written as and when, original, attributable, that is signed and dated, complete date, any changes and corrections endorsed and recorded by the investigator. So mental trial essential documents. Next. So this is my research room in the Spurs AY wing. Next. So on the left hand side, so this cupboard shows so at room temperature the oral IP. So now you know that one of the important oral drug is olaparib. We have in the past of osimertinib. So these are kept in the room temperature, and so this shows the log and the temperature that is maintained. On the right hand side, we know that those who are in the clinical trial, the importance of thermometer. So with the date, time, and it is recorded. Next. So on the left hand side, there is a -80-degree deep freezer. So which we keep for the PK samples, because lots of biosimilar drugs are now there. So the PK samples are so important. And on the right hand side, you can see this is a refrigerator where we store most of the other drugs, that is in 2 to 8 degrees. And for everything you need a log to be maintained. And every day once my staff enters, so they need to maintain and sign it. Next. So on the left hand side, these are the files. These are case files and the source notes for most of the patients. So these are racks. On the right hand side, you can see a cooling centrifuge. So where for most of the PK samples get centrifuged and they are stored at -80°. Next. Next.
I think again Biswas's problem has started.
Sir, I've stopped your video, so sir, it'll be easier due to the low bandwidth, sir.
So this was the this is the infrastructure, the AV recording. So many of the sponsors help us with these cameras. So most of the time in the past we had an AV recording, so which is not a regular phenomenon now. Next. So this is there are two research rooms. So you can see. So Mr. Siddharth Manti, who heads the research. So we have 8 people at work. Next. So the pathology department in the hospital so need to be approved. Next. So different radiology department, which are basic things we require in during clinical trial: X-rays, ultrasounds, echoes, and the CT scan. Next. Rest like MRI and PET-CT, we actually outsource. This is a casualty. Next. So this is the ICU. At times when a ACE happens, the patient lands up in the ICU. Next. So the glimpse, so total EC meetings since inception is 48. So that is 15th of January 2021 was the last. Total approvals and amendment is 125. If you can see the oncology trials completed and ongoing or 51, yet to start 5. So the major being the drug trial, 236 patients were enrolled, in the registry 37, diagnostic 84, and biotissues almost 70. And on the right hand side, these are non-oncology. Next. So meeting during even the COVID times. So we also had 2 physical meetings, and on the right hand side, you can see a hybrid meeting where 4 members are present and 5 are online. Next, at Zoom. So before COVID-19, so these are my EC members, and during COVID-19, those EC meetings that happened. Next. So our supporters from the leading CROs from Lambda, Parexel, Equivia, Zero, Axis, Lotus, Vidacare, Navitas. So I thanks all of them. Leading sponsors have been AstraZeneca, Novartis, Intas, Zydus, Dr. Reddy's, Bayer, Teva, Celerity, and Jinan Pharmaceutical, and many others. Next. So trial processing of explaining. So you need to sit down with the patient and the attendant in your room. Next. So these are like on the left hand side, probable benefits you explain to the patient and the attendants for enrolling into the trial, and also possible risk associated. Next. So on the left hand side, a cost and compensation for an AE or a SAE, and on the right hand side, privacy and confidential policies. Next. So we need to allow ample time to review. So especially in Odisha, we need to give them Odia also, Odia, Hindi, and English most of the times. Encourage patient to ask questions so there are no doubts once you start that enrolling in the trial. Next. So provide contact information for assistance or advance. Try to keep 1-2 mobile land phones so that you can always ask the patient. So if they doesn't follow up, especially we had this difficulty during the COVID times. Next. So get signatures from the participant, so from the researcher or the investigator, and an impartial witness to enter the study. Next. So these are my patient tracker on the left hand side. So these are all those high-end tests like the PDL1, the NGS, and on the right hand side every month. So these are the patients who are scheduled for the oral drugs for an evaluation or follow-up, or the injectable drugs. Next. So the number of oncology trials at first till date. So it started from 2013 with the help of Dr. Soren Das, when we had a prostate cancer, a biclotamide study, and a cancer vaccine for an adenocarcinoma CL lung. And over the years 2017-18 has really been phenomenal. So 2009, so 2018 and 19, there was a dip because of some new regulations came up, and even in COVID, you can see, so we had a good number of patients in the clinical trials. Next. So the feather in the cap, so I've been a part of good number of clinical trials, which we can always adhere to, is a Himalayan trial for an immunological drugs for a metastatic SCC. Amelie trial is a low dose versus standard dose, which has got completed for ribociclib in hormone positive breast cancer. Soli trial is an ongoing olaparib for BRCA mutated metastatic breast cancer and platinum sensitive recurrent ovarian cancer, concordance and Kindle. Next. So I thank everybody, and especially thanks my resident and my research staff who has helped me to make the slides also. Thank you so much.
Ghanashyam sir, we have another finished little early, so we have some questions. Can we ask questions?
Yeah, please, please.
So you said some difficulty in outsourcing investigations. Did you face any difficulty in outsourcing the investigation? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm able to hear. So like especially we need a MRI at times. PET scan may not be a regular phenomenon. And one thing that is a bone scans for this, especially the nuclear medicine and nuclear test. No, so we need to outsource. So what we have done, we have signed an MAU. So once we get that trial, a particular requirement, like I have a denosumab trial. So where the important investigation is a bone scan. So we have a signed MOU. So with a particular institute who has the bone scan. So I think that's not a problem, because ultimately the patient has to go because they don't have to pay the money. So it actually comes to our budget. So at the end of, so we have a MOU signed, and so we manage that way.
So in the COVID times, sir, you said there were difficulties. I think one or two. I think we have another 1 or 5 minutes. We can.
Yeah. Please.
This particular incident, we need to know that where our infrastructure was not able to cope up with COVID times.
So many patients, like I can say you, so we had a Amelie trial of ribociclib. We know that such a good drug, costly drug, so patients gets benefited. So the two patients dropped out, said they did not come. And so almost 6 months follow-up. So this patient could not be enrolled. The another patient, we lost the patient. So she was almost 100 kilometers away. So even of repeated calls, so they did not receive it. We also lost one of the patients of TNBC, who is almost 250 kilometers. So this patient was doing good on the TNBC new drug from Intas, and this patient had a good response. So this patient actually progressed when she came almost 3 months later. So definitely, so there were many dropouts, and the patients who were actually doing good actually had a progression, because there was a lack of communication, so the patient could not come. Even we asked many of the CROs for a grant. So even there are many CROs, many sponsors, they almost to the tune of 10,000 rupees they wanted to give as a transport. But still, so the vehicles were not there, the transport system was not there in the peak of COVID.
Right. There's a question from Dr. Parida. Can you define an impartial witness?
So impartial witness means, so especially these are patients who are not a relative of the patient, and who are not the patient attendant or the staff who is not directly involved in the hospital staff. So what we do, so we ask one of the different patient attendant to come and do that as an impartial witness.
So, sir, in the passing mention, you said AV recording, you're not doing so much now. So
yeah, AV recording. So in 2017, 18, 19, so that 2.5 years, so that was must. And once the rule changed 2018 last, no, so any investigator cannot have more than 2 trials. So I have now 18 ongoing trials. So there was so much of restrictions in that time. So after that episode of Indore episode, no, so there were clinical trials, numbers were down. So every patient has to be, every trial had an AV recording. So now it is not must for AV recording. Is none. It's only of the few of the trials only they ask for an AV recording.
Which are the
Which is
trials
not
that ask for AV recording? Which of the trials are not asking? I mean, like there is any trend there?
So overall, most of the trials they don't ask for AV recording at this moment.
So in the same case, when we used to do the same trial, no, it was very painful. You had to read every word of the consent form, and if they ask, every question has to be attended. It was very laborious. Sir, shall we? Shall we? There are no questions. We'll start second session, sir. We have heads up.
Yes, please go ahead.
Sir, Dr. Shyam, sir, we will start with a session, sir.
Right, Dr. Vinayak.
Thank you, sir.
So, good evening, everyone, and thanks, Purvish and Vinayak, for inviting. So, I think my job is to take you through the feasibility questionnaire in clinical trials, which is the first step before the site is and the investigator is selected for a particular study or a clinical trial. So, can I have the next slide? Yeah. So, of course, the first thing which we get from the CRO or from the sponsor is a CDA, that is the confidentiality, which we sign on our part, and only then the CRO or the sponsor will send the feasibility questionnaire to us. So, these are some of the selection criteria for the investigator and for the CROs to determine whether the site is fit to conduct or participate in the said trial. So I think things have been highlighted by Dr. Ghanashyam, that you've got to have staff, you've got to have space, you've got to have storage, and of course the subjects. In addition, so this is all being judged through the feasibility questionnaire, which is sent to you by the investigating agency. Expertise, experience, equipment. So I'll just come to these. So we also need, of course, lab logistics. I think ethics was initially, when we started doing trials, there were no SOPs and there were a lot of issues to begin with. But now, of course, as the CDSCO has put guidelines for ethics committee and SOPs, so now, of course, things have become extremely streamlined in the last 5 to 10 years. Then, of course, you need to have these certification, compliance, contract costs, etc. So, of course, in order for us to conduct any study or participate in a trial, we need to have time, training, and ability to sort of meet with each other depending upon the requirement of the study. So I think these are important inputs, which I think the feasibility questionnaire tries to assess when it is sent to an investigator. Next slide, please. So this is what I said is the first, questionnaire for a feasibility study. And then, of course, there is this initial contact by phone or email, followed by a site selection visit, then the report, discussion, and a decision is taken. But I think that is here, the questionnaire, feasibility questionnaire, which the investigator fills up, is a very, very critical part of the starting process for selection of a site, which I think is not only science, but perhaps also an art. Next, please. So what are the motivation for an investigator to join in a study? One, of course, is scientific interest, recognition and publication, etc. Because I think you get to know about newer drugs, because as we all understand that a lot of studies which we get are a part of the multi-center trials, which are initiated abroad. So you might have heard about the drug, and you certainly want to have a first-hand information and knowledge, and the practical aspect, which is what the trial gives you. Of course, if the drug turns out to be good, it is of benefit to the patient as well. So you have an additional option for patients who are not responding to the previous treatments. And of course, in a country like ours, especially in phase 2, 3, or even phase 4 studies, the cost of the treatment and the adverse events, etc., are borne by the company. Appropriate fee is, of course, an important thing which you earn. So there is a you're earning from the participation in the study, and funds for improved equipment and facilities. And I think we have all gained from the participation of these research trials by having additional equipment and facilities added through their funding. Patients, of course, benefit through the relief of symptoms. There's long-term treatment because these patients would be on follow-up, and therefore, that is helpful for the patients. And then, of course, regular checkups and contact with the medical staff, reduce treatment or clinic attendance costs because there are travel allowances, etc. So these are all the benefits for participating in the studies for various investigators and for patients, and therefore there is a need to promote this. Next, please. So coming to main thing, which is the feasibility data, this isn't just about estimated recruitment rates from investigators, because there are several other issues and other things, which is what we will be discussing. Next, please. So I think before we are participating in any study, we need to understand what is the phase of the study and the study design, whether it is phase 1, 2, 3, or a phase 4 study. And I think certain centers are not able to participate in the PK studies or phase 1 studies. So you need to understand the limitation before you, even look at the feasibility questionnaire. I mean, are you really able to participate in that study? Then, of course, the complexity of the study protocol. For example, if it is a double-blind, a placebo-controlled study, so you really need to have blinded people, and of course, you need to understand the complexity. The investigator grant, of course, you have to negotiate with the CRO or with the sponsor. Then, of course, very important patient recruitment approaches. Advertisements are usually not desirable and are sort of prohibited by most of the ethics committees. But I think before you fill up a feasibility questionnaire for a particular project, you need to have the strategy in mind, whether you have database, etc. Then reimbursement for equivalent treatment and assessment, which should be there inbuilt in the study. Then, of course, competing studies is an important, because if you have 2 studies or 3 studies on lung cancer, you may not be able to, fulfill your commitment to a particular study. So that is an important aspect. I mean, one should not be perhaps, taking on one subject too many studies. Of course, I think as they were pointing out that at some point there was a limitation on studies, that you should have 4 studies or 5 studies maximum for one particular investigator, which perhaps is not a bad idea, because I mean, we are all busy practitioners. So unless you have a very, very big research team, and then of course you have to have appropriate staff and the motivation to conduct these studies. So the next, so we'll come to the practical aspects. Next slide, please. So I think in general terms, the clinical trial feasibility is a process of evaluating the possibility of conducting a particular clinical trial or a program in a particular geographical region with the overall objective of optimum project completion in terms of timelines, targets, and cost. So I think that is what maybe the global person, because as I said, these are usually multi-center trials, so which are initiated from abroad. So they would be looking at a facility of where you can meet these objectives through a CRO, or they can do it themselves, by having an office in our country or in India. So that is a broad objective of this feasibility questionnaire, that whether you can complete the project in a specified time, meet the targets, and of course India and as a developing nation is considered as a site because the costs are lower, number one, and of course the number of patients we can provide is significant, And third, of course, since these trials, originate in Europe or US, so we have this, command on the language, so which is, in our favor. So that is why people, have come over to our country to enroll patients and complete these trials in a specified period of time. Next, please. So I think this is what we'll just be coming to. The next slide. So let's come to the practical aspect, because Dr. Purvish was very keen that we just cover the practical issues. Let's have the next slide. Next slide, please. Next. Okay, so I think let's come to the practical aspects. Next, yeah. So I think I've just split this into two parts. So what are the responsibilities of the sponsor or the CRO? So one thing, which has come to the attention of the investigators is, so when we are asked to fill up a feasibility questionnaire, people or the CRO or the sponsors, they get information regarding the site as to what are the number of patients we have on a particular disease, maybe in general cancer, what is your load of the cases at that particular time of point of time. And then, of course, related to the study, for example, if you are in a lung cancer study, they would ask you what numbers you are getting for non-small cell, for non-squamous, for squamous, for small cell. And then, that information which you are imparting to the CRO or to the sponsor becomes their database, which could be, reflecting the right thing for that particular time. So, for example, if I filled a feasibility questionnaire 2 or 3 years ago, it may not be valid, 3 years later. But then that CRO could, pass on that information to another site or another, colleague, etc., etc. So I think maintaining confidentiality of the information which you are providing to the CRO or sponsor should be, inbuilt in the agreement which we have with the CRO or sponsor. Then, of course, this process of filling up the questionnaire is, of course, time consuming to some extent. And there are issues of payment to the investigator for completing the questionnaire. So some of the, I believe the sponsors particularly, so if your site gets selected, well, they do pay you for the, the questionnaire which you filled, and you spend the time on filling up the questionnaire. But a lot of Indian CROs will not compensate you for filling up the questionnaire. So that, I think, is an issue which maybe one can discuss before you start filling up the feasibility questionnaire for a particular project. But these are, CRO and sponsor dependent decisions. But then I think a lot of us perhaps would fill up a questionnaire irrespective of, unless you have so many trials where you can become choosy and you can insist on the payment regarding, filling up the questionnaire. So I think, to my mind, these are two important responsibilities on the part of sponsor or CRO, that they should maintain confidentiality about the information which you are providing to them for that particular subject or for that particular disease entity, and it should not be shared with anybody. And then, of course, the payment issue. Next slide. So now coming to the responsibilities of the investigator. So I think it is imperative on the part of the PI to give correct information and not, sort of, in order to get the trial, say that you have, a very high number of patients coming to you and they would be willing to participate in the study or a trial. And this is an important issue to my mind, especially in the private sector, where actually, you may be seeing a large number of patients, but when you request them or you ask them to enroll in a study, the dropouts are huge. So this is what perhaps you learn from experience. And when you are not able to fulfill your commitment, say 3 patients or 4 patients in a month, well, then the CRO and sponsor, they start looking differently at you, that perhaps provided incorrect information to get onto the boat or in the ship of that particular study, but then now you're not fulfilling that commitment. So I think one needs to give a reasonably correct estimate in his or her mind, so that you're not caught subsequently on the other side, that you're not fulfilling your commitment. So I think this is a very important issue to my mind in fulfilling when you are filling up the feasibility questionnaire. I think the ethics committee details and SOPs have now become fairly standard, and most of the institutions have them. I think in the ethics committee, you need to have an advocate, you need to have a lady, you need to have a person from NGO, you need to have a pharmacologist, you need to have at least 9 or 11 members. And so those details are fairly clear, and the SOPs are also there, which you need to adhere to. So if you are committing, the ethics committee is saying that they will have one meeting in a month, so it is the responsibility of the ethics committee to conduct that meeting, because if you delay the meeting for whatever reason, then again the sponsor and CRO looks upon the institution in a different way. So I think these are very, very important matters, and in the COVID era, we did have difficulties in that, and actually in our hospital, they took a waiver because people were not able to meet. So, and that information has to be passed on to the CRO or to the sponsor, so that these are, because ultimately the feasibility questionnaire is to be filled by the PI, and that information needs to be passed on to the sponsor or CRO, because there could be a delay in the approval of a particular project. So in the feasibility questionnaire, I think they do ask you the details of the hospital regarding the bed availability. I think it was pointed out that what equipment is available in terms of centrifuges and refrigerators and deep freeze. And of course, on the investigation front, whether you have all the infrastructure to do the CT scans,